Good Saturday morning to everybody, and welcome to Legal Notes with attorneys Ned Barron and Mary Ann Charron. Good morning.
Morning, Gary.
Good morning.
You know, I love talking about stars, and we just had the Golden Globes this past week, and people were talking. It was all virtual, of course, and recently, as you know, Larry King passed away. So what I wanted to do, I thought maybe we kind of have some, I don't want to say have some fun with this, because this is kind of sad if you think about it, but it's interesting nonetheless. Maybe talk about some estate planning mistakes that some of the stars have made. And if anything, maybe we can learn from their mistakes so that something good can come out of something bad.
Yeah, I think that's really, I think that's a great idea. Thank you. People are people, right? Yeah. So it doesn't matter how much money you have if you don't want to deal with whatever your family dynamic is, or the issues, or your own mortality, right? And stars, maybe because of their lives, they're like bigger than life kind of people, and maybe they don't want to think about those things. So yeah, I don't know. What do you think, Ned?
Sure. We have a lot of examples, especially in the music industry, of people who, didn't plan, or they planned badly and didn't know. They didn't seek out advice from an attorney, estate planning attorney, like we are.
Oh, God.
I know.
I don't know. They're surrounded by people, right? You would think that they probably did get the advice, but maybe they just never made the appointment or came back or wanted to have the conversation. We don't know.
You talk about rock stars who passed away, real early ages. We talked about The Who. Talk about Keith Moon, who in the 70s he passed away. And not in his 70s, but in the 70s. I think it was 79 that he passed away. But as a young man, I'm not saying that this is the way to do it, but most people don't think of creating a will when they're in their 20s and 30s, okay? Yeah. But to not have one, I said earlier off the air in 80s, certainly into your 90s, but even in your 70s, even when you get into your 60s, when you have a family, I think when you get married and start having children of your own, to not have a will is rather irresponsible. Wouldn't you agree? Or
if you want to talk about like Larry King, for example.
Yes, exactly.
He's someone who is in the midst of a divorce, right? And, he did have an estate plan with his wife who he was divorcing. He had quite a few children, but, he's someone who clearly, had a lot of life circumstances. So we have he had several former spouses. He had several children. He had a lot of assets. He had a lot of issues and was very sick. And, so he kind of he hits all the notes, so to speak. But I don't know. I mean, we were talking earlier about some of the stars who died young, like Jimi Hendrix. I think he was. Sure, yeah. He's one of them. It took over 30 years for his estate to settle.
Are you really 30 years?
Yeah.
What was the contention on?
Go ahead.
Well, I think oftentimes when you have someone who has a lot of money or who has a catalog of songs,
yes,
right, or albums, right, that they. Not only the value isn't just what their assets are as of that date, but there's that ongoing value. We've talked, we've heard about Michael Jackson. What's the value of his music catalog? Or Prince, for example.
Prince is a big
example. He died in 2016. He didn't have a will. His estate was valued at over $200 million. And you think of someone who Prince kept ownership and control over his own music. He had his own record label. He had a whole lot of business interests, and he had no will. And it's one of those bizarre situations. I mean, and he had no spouse or children, but he had 6 siblings and half siblings. So you can imagine that there are a lot of people who
it was a feeding frenzy. They all went right for it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it's again one of those things where his estate is still not settled either. I mean, from 2016.
How long? You said 30 years.
30 years for Hendrix.
Hendrix. Is that the longest it's ever taken?
Well, I don't know.
To have an estate settled? Or?
I don't know of anything that's taken, in my experience, I've never had anything take 30 years. But in his, you have to think back to the 70s. People weren't as concerned about copyright, and it was a lot looser then. And now we have, like, who's entitled to be paid for using Jimi Hendrix's image, right? We see it everywhere. So someone at that point, I don't know if attorneys were, I don't want to say that savvy, because clearly they were very bright people back then. That's not it. But I don't know that people really thought that was worth a lot of money, right? Now all those things are worth significant amount of money. Images, names of songs, and replays,
Oh, yeah.
Record labels who owned someone for life, right? We've seen those movies where performers got pennies for performing and for their own songs, and the record labels made so much money off of them. So in his case, there were lots to fight about, and clearly he was entitled to his image. But I honestly, do you know, Ned? I don't know anything that's taken as long as that.
30 years is a long time.
So
yeah, I don't.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought I heard somewhere that Larry King, although he didn't have a will, right? He wrote something down on a piece of paper. And somebody found it? Is that legal? First of all, if that's true, if that's even true, let's say it is for a second. Is that legal? I mean, if it's just, even if they determine, oh yeah, that's his handwriting, yeah, that looks like it really genuinely was, but is it legal?
Well, that's a great question. And in Connecticut, that's called, a handwritten will is called a holographic will.
Okay.
And in Connecticut, they are not recognized as valid wills. Other states do recognize holographic wills as valid wills. So I think, where did Larry King pass away?
He's in California.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
He was a big Dodgers fan. He was always right behind home plate next to Mary Hart.
Okay.
No, seriously. Mary Hart would be with her husband, and Larry King would be like 2 seats away on the other side of Mary Hart. And, the camera would always, you're zooming right into the plate, and you see them both.
Yeah.
All
Interesting.
The time. Yeah.
Well, the thing about Larry King, though, is that he did have a very extensive estate plan done in 2015 with his wife. So they, I'm sure, had top estate planning attorneys that did their estate plan.
Right.
I mean, his estate at his death was, and when I talk about estate, we're talking about a probate estate. So those are the assets that are solely owned with no beneficiary designation. And he only had $2 million of probate assets, which would be controlled by a will. The rest of his fortune, which is valued at something like $141 million, those were all in trusts. And so that isn't part of the controversy that's going on with Larry King. The controversy is that while he had a will that he signed in 2015 that would have controlled that $2 million in assets, just prior to his death, he hand wrote a will, cutting out his wife that he was in the middle of they were in the middle of getting a divorce. So cutting her out and leaving that $2 million to his children. And that's the controversy, that he was, sick at the time, he was old, all these things that.
But I've seen a copy of it. I saw what it looked like, and it's literally on a piece of just lined paper, like notebook paper, right?
People could say that's not even his. They could say, hey, he didn't write that.
Three sentences long, and it says, I give everything to my 5 children, and 2 of whom had predeceased him. and it puts his son, one of his children, Larry Jr., in charge of everything. So, but that's, and he's the Larry Jr. is the one who said, oh, by the way, here's my father's will. So he's the one who showed up with this.
And Larry Jr. is the one that really made himself known to Larry, like when he was in his 30s, right?
Yeah.
Larry King Sr. didn't even know he had a son named
Didn't even
Larry
know.
King Jr.
No, divorced the mom.
All right.
Several years, when she was pregnant, apparently, but he didn't know that she was pregnant. And
so as I'm processing this, and I'm taking something that you said into consideration here, you said specifically that Connecticut doesn't recognize any handwritten holographic wills, right? But from what I understand, because of his season tickets with the Dodgers, I'm pretty sure, though not 100% sure, that Larry King lived in L.A. or lived in California. Yeah. I don't know what they have, and for the purposes of this show, I guess it really doesn't matter. But my point is that
California does allow.
They do allow. Okay, so let's say that they determined it was his handwriting and it was him. Okay, he's got to deal with that. But if there's anything to take away from this, it's that it's all the more the reason here in the state of Connecticut to have an actual will drawn up by an attorney. What's the process, though, if someone wants to contest a will and say, oh, I don't know about this? I would imagine that's a whole field of weeds, right?
And it's expensive. And it's an expensive field of weeds. Yeah.
Well, but if there's a potential pot of gold at the end of that, there are people who are hell-bent and determined to go, I'll sit this whole thing out, because as lengthy as you may state that it takes, and I take you at your word, you would know, and as detailed as it may take, it's all relative. If there's a lot of money at the end of that, they'll wait it out, right? You must have seen those cases.
Well, it's interesting, the Prince case that we've been talking about, that there's actually some guy who is an inmate at a federal prison who is claiming that he's one of Prince's heirs, too.
Yeah.
So that just throws, anyone, this is one of the things about a will is that a will has to go through probate court. So once a will is submitted to probate court and an estate is created, there is a ready venue already. So it doesn't cost a lot of money for someone to walk into that court and say, I'm making a claim against this estate as a beneficiary or a creditor or something like that.
An heir,
because they didn't have to create the controversy in a court, in a superior court, let's say. There's already a ready venue, so they walk in. And this is one of the reasons why when you hear about creating revocable living trusts, for example, it's a way of distributing your assets at your death outside of probate. And so if you did have someone who wanted to make trouble, let's say it was a beneficiary, a child that was cut out because they were
estranged
the bad
or
child,
something,
or estranged or something like that.
Yeah.
There is not a ready venue going on. They actually have to go to the probate court and open up a controversy in that court, and it costs them money, and they're going to typically need an attorney to do that.
And there's no guarantee anyway, right?
Well, sure.
Just because you spend the money doesn't necessarily mean that.
Right, but what it does is that it creates a delay. It creates administrative hassle. It just creates a lot of trouble for the people who would rightfully be the beneficiaries. So by doing a revocable living trust, it is sort of a bar to entry for someone that just wants to make trouble.
So in the Larry King case, he had the bulk of his assets were already in trust. So what his son Larry Jr. is really fighting about is everything that's left over, everything that his father didn't put in trust. So if Larry Sr., if Dad had put everything in trust, Larry Jr. could come forward and he could say, wait a minute, I deserve something. But deserving 0 of 0, you still get 0, right? Right? So you don't get anything. And the controversy would be over. Prince, if he had a estate plan, anybody, doesn't have to be the people that we're talking about, right? But if you had created some of those documents, even love children, those children that you didn't know existed, but you had some relationship with a woman a long time ago and brings forth a child saying, this is your heir, then, right? That's what happens. We've seen it. What was which prince? There was he ended up abdicating to his another son, but there was a woman who came forward, and he never even knew the woman existed, and she was a child he had in a relationship.
Prince?
Not this prince, no.
Oh.
Another.
I probably
talking about an actual royal.
I got you now. I'm trying to differentiate all the princes here.
Yeah, but you have the guy that Ned's talking about from prison saying, I'm one of his, I'm an heir, right?
I should have really disclosed this at the beginning of the show. I feel a little bad now. No, I'm a third cousin of Prince, so we met once. It was years ago. I made him a grinder. He liked it. We were at a family event.
Is this true?
And I feel awkward now discussing it now because I probably shouldn't. But I think he once told me when we were playing softball later on with the rest of the family, and as we were both sitting on the bench, he's like, that's a hell of a sandwich you made me. I'm putting you in my will. I didn't think it because we were young. And I'm thinking to myself now, but I probably can. You
didn't keep it. You didn't keep the will.
It was verbal. It was something he said. Now,
it wasn't on the receipt of the sandwich you made him.
Well, no. But my point is now: is a verbal promise? Does that mean anything? Does that carry any weight?
That's interesting. Go ahead.
That's actually a great question. One case that comes to mind about verbal promises is Marlon Brando, and his housekeeper claimed after he died that he promised her that he was going to leave her his house. And, of course, there was nothing in writing about that. And he did have a will and all that. And she ended up suing the estate, and she sued the estate for the house plus $2 million in damages. What she finally ended up settling for is $125,000. So that's a pretty expensive nuisance.
Yeah, but they probably just paid her that, right, just to get rid of her? Or...
Yeah, but there was litigation. I mean, the estate had to have hired attorneys and had to litigate it to get it to that point where they were finally going to settle. And that's one of the things that it's expensive to litigate, no matter what you're litigating. So trying to, planning properly so that you can avoid that is always a good thing to do.
But just to answer your question, an oral promise that was never committed to writing is not going to be worth anything
because you can't substantiate it.
No, I mean, I suppose it's possible that if instead of just having that family picnic with Prince, right, you had over a period of time performed some level of services for which you had not been paid, and in exchange for that, you saying, well, wait a minute, this was the consideration that he was going to give me. That at least gives you something to go to court with. But otherwise, I've certainly seen mom said I could have this. So-and-so said I could have this, or was going to leave me this account.
Prove it.
And if it was never done before they died, then you would not be able to get it.
Hell of a shortstop, by the way, Prince. Folks, you are listening to Legal Notes with attorneys Ned Barron and Mary Ann Charron. I'm Gary Byron. There's some others. You mentioned, of course, Prince. You mentioned Michael Jackson. We were talking, of course, about Larry King. There's some other celebrities, right, that did not have a will.
Yeah, well, I did want to mention...
You mentioned Hendrix, too.
I did. And there's Bob Marley is kind of interesting because he had so many children. He died without a will. And now one of the things where every state has their own laws as to... He was married, okay? So there was the wife and his 10 children.
His what?
He had 10 children. I think he had 10.
10 or 11, I think.
Yeah. I want to say it almost doesn't matter because where he lived, the wife was only entitled to the same fractional share as the children. So the estate was divided into 11th. So she received 1/11 and the children each received 1/11. Here in Connecticut, if you die without a will and the children, you and your wife, the children are yours. The spouse gets the first 100,000, but 50% of the estate. So here you have someone who probably needed some level of support, the wife, and she was only entitled to a very small percentage of his estate because he didn't have a will. It's kind of interesting. And then for him, battling over, he's another person talking about the likeness and image,
right.
and his music catalog and things like that. I mean, people like his image is emblazoned on T-shirts,
absolutely, that's right,
and everything, and stuff like that. Sonny Bono. I mean, can you believe that?
Didn't Cher make a claim against?
Right. I guess I don't. I grew up watching the Sonny and Cher show, right? Yeah. And I remember watching the dynamic between that relationship, and even as a kid, I knew, boy, this isn't going to last. There was that really awful animosity between them. But anyway.
Well, even when she started dating Greg Allman, the show was still a hit. So she had to go back on stage with Sonny, her ex-husband, and do this show and pretend everything was great. Meanwhile, she's shacking up with Greg Allman.
And she shows up on stage with her blonde kids, and Sonny's
right? Yes,
got black hair. Anyway, but Sonny, as we know, he went on to have a career as a congressman and was married. He's mayor of his town in I forgot what state he was in.
California.
But right, California. But he was married for a long time to another woman, but he died without a will. And when we talk about the people, the crazies coming out of the woodwork, well, Cher even made a claim against his estate, and they had been divorced for who knows how many years, 30 years or...
And there was another person who claimed to be his child who also showed up, right? So another love child. And so just leaving his wife, Mary, who eventually took over for him when he, as congresswoman, and she had a huge mess on her hands as a result of that.
What about Aretha Franklin?
Oh, Aretha, right? The pieces of paper found in the couch.
Is that what it was?
Yeah.
Well, when Aretha first died, and her niece had gone to the probate court to say there's no will, so this is what we call an intestate estate, and so everything that was owned by the decedent is going to pass according to the laws of intestacy, and there's a pecking order about who gets what. But a year later, they ended up finding in a locked cabinet 2 handwritten wills, and they also found another handwritten will that that was done after those 2 handwritten wills that were locked away. This third handwritten will they found under the couch cushions in the living room. A year later.
True. And they all say something different.
How authentic is it?
Well, I guess they're still fighting over it,
Exactly.
right?
Oh, are they really? She only died. I know she died a few years ago.
Yeah.
We're running out of time. I want to bring up a couple of names really fast, though.
Go ahead.
Because all the more reason to have a will made up, particularly here in the state of Connecticut, because as you term this, holographic wills, in other words, the ones that you do on your own, you write down on a piece of paper or on a notebook, are not deemed as legal here in the state of Connecticut. Correct. All the more the reason to contact both Marianne and or Ned. Let's really quickly, because we're running out of time. I'm going to give you a couple of names. You tell me about their wills. Howard Hughes.
Well, he ended up having one. Well, they thought, and it was vague. So he
was fake.
so here's somebody, right? So you talk about
so he forged
it. But the amount of time and effort that had to be undergone to determine it, so you think he died without one. Okay, then you have that series of drama. And then you find one. And you go, okay, here's the one that's the will. And then you have another series of drama related to the fact that it was a forgery.
Well, that's another legal issue altogether, then.
It sure is. Yeah.
Abe Lincoln, the founder of the Republican Party.
I know.
Did he have a will or no?
No, he did not.
Had a will.
And he was a lawyer. Don't forget.
He should know better. Oh, no.
The shoemaker who didn't have shoes. I don't know.
So Mary ended up getting nothing, or...
Well, I don't even know.
What was probate court like even in the mid-1800s, excuse me.
Right. I don't
1860s.
even know. And I don't think he was really that wealthy of a man by what we would consider, standards today, right? So he had very little.
It makes it all the more worthwhile
to
get this done. And really, at any age, I hate to say that. I know there's people, they could be listening in their 30s right now, or even their 40s. You really need to document things, particularly here in the state of Connecticut. You cannot write something down on a piece of paper, as we've just learned. If there's anything to take away from this show, I mean, we're kind of, I hate to say this, but we're learning at the others' expenses here. We're using some other people's celebrity, which I know you're allowed to do, but trying to learn from them. If there's anything you take away from this, is you can't write something down, folks, on a piece of paper, hide it away, put it in your safe, tell your children, tell your spouse, I got all my instructions here. The state of Connecticut does not recognize that. All the more reason to contact Charter Oak Law Group. Seriously, they are in Bloomfield. They by appointment only. They're in Danbury and Norwalk. But in Bloomfield, 860-570-1229. Again, 860-570-1229. You need to talk to Ned Barron and or Mary Ann Charron. I got it really quickly. How long, if someone contacts you on Monday, how long before they can actually sit down and have a meeting with you?
Well, because of COVID, we don't sit down, but we have Zoom meetings.
Okay.
And it could be that week. It just depends on what our schedules are. But, in what that person's schedule is, right? But to talk to someone just to understand what's going on in their life and what's important to them, you know, it doesn't take that long.
I'm going to repeat that phone number, 860-570-1229. By the way, you can check them out online as well, www.charteroaklaw.com. Once again, charteroaklaw.com. Incidentally, if you want to email, you can email the show. Maybe we can get your question answered on these very airwaves. Or if you've got something more of a private nature, again, you can do legalnotes@charteroaklaw.com. All right, for Ned Barron and Mary Ann Charron, I'm Gary Byron. Thank you so much for listening to Legal Notes. Until next Saturday, have a good one, everybody. So long.